Hey guys, I made a video, or I am making a video on the vulnerabilities of like adults and people in general. This is a video that I've wanted to make for a while, but I just kind of like hadn't gotten around to it. So that's what I'm making a video about. I think if you ask most people, they would say that they are not a vulnerable person. Which I find really interesting. I just think people probably would answer the question that way because they haven't actually like even assessed themselves for vulnerabilities, let alone figured out what their vulnerabilities are. But I do feel like one reason I'm so passionate about like talking about adult grooming and trying to explain like why it can happen and how it happens is because we really don't even understand what vulnerable people really like are. Yeah, it can be someone who is depressed or lonely or things like that, but more than anything, I think people are vulnerable not just because of maybe like emotional needs that they have that aren't being fulfilled, but also because of how they think about themselves and life and other people. And there are things that make you incredibly vulnerable to brainwashing. And one of those is already having a predisposition mentally to fantasy-based bonding and believing that people are trustworthy based on how they make you feel, not being able to assess your environment for facts, but instead only really assessing your environment for feelings. That's a really dangerous tendency to have. The other thing that makes you incredibly vulnerable to brainwashing is having a predisposition to black and white thinking, which I see permeating our society more and more as a whole, at least in America. I just see an incredible lack of nuance being presented to us everywhere. And so because we're not being encouraged to see nuance or think in nuance because of social media, political spheres going on, lots of different things that are kind of dividing people and pushing people to feel like they need to be on one side or the other. I'm not saying that we can all sit in the middle. Sometimes you do have to get off the bench and actually pick a side. But even when you're picking a side, I think having the ability to still see the nuances within people, how life isn't just good or bad, no situation is just one thing or the other. There are so many different layers and aspects to everything, and you can pick a side while still being able to see all of those things. But what I see happening with people is that they're no longer able to see all of the things because they feel like in order to pick the side as almost a trauma response, to pick the side that they want to be on or feel that they need to be on, they have to stop seeing all of those things. Because to see the nuance, to see the mixture of layers within a person or a situation is almost to be unloyal in a sort of way to that side that they're picking, which just isn't true. Going back to the vulnerable person though, like one thing that I started developing a slideshow to like show to people a couple of years ago. And one of the slides that I really felt like was the most important within it was I found all of these different stock images and I wanted to use them to kind of point to how we're not good at recognizing vulnerabilities or even thinking of different people as vulnerable. And so there were just different pictures that I found. One was of a firefighter rescuing a little girl from a fire. And if you look at this picture, the question I would ask is, who do you think the vulnerable person is? And most people would obviously say the child. We tend to think of vulnerability in terms of age, sex, gender, race, lots of different things can make us biased in this area. But I would argue that both people could be vulnerable because we think that the child is obviously vulnerable and the child can be very vulnerable because of her age, the fact that there's a fire and she's small and she can't necessarily find her way out. She has less knowledge than the firefighter. Lots of things are going on. But the firefighter can also be a vulnerable person, you know, like not in terms of his job, but just in terms of the fact that like what's going on with him internally and how he thinks about himself and how he thinks about his life in terms of his self-esteem, his self-image, his beliefs about love, his beliefs about just the expectations he should have of relationships in the world. So he very much can be a vulnerable person as well. Then there's an image of a nurse, you know, and a person in a wheelchair. Obviously, the person in the wheelchair is a vulnerable person. We look at emotional needs, physical limitations, lots of things like that. Those are all valid. The nurse can also be a vulnerable person because she might be drained from her job and extra fatigued and tired. And that is its own type of vulnerability. And again, you don't know what her internal world and her internal sort of system looks like for how she thinks about herself. The other thing that I wanted to do in the slideshows that I made was to look at the predator and who we consider predatory. And again, showing pictures of who you would assume is the predator in different pictures. A lot of people, you know, when looking at this picture are probably going to assume that it's not the woman. A lot of people in this picture would assume that it's the old man, not the child. And children can be predators. It can start at a very young age. You know, one of the hardest things I personally think to come to terms with in life is that we don't get to just decide that someone is completely toxic and 100% predatory with no vulnerabilities or any other aspects to themselves just because we don't like them, just because we've had some negative experiences with them, just because they've caused us some kind of internal pain on our own, which is still valid, and you still have the right to feel that pain, acknowledge that pain, process that pain. But I just think we're starting to exist in a reality a little too much where people are thinking once again in black and white and saying like, that person's not vulnerable, that person has no reason to deserve any sympathy from me simply because I've had negative experiences from them, or because I personally don't like them, because our personalities just don't gel well together, because they cause me frustration and annoyance and they're not something easy for me to like and something easy for me to get along with. Just because of that, they now officially go in some sort of like trash bin in my mind, and I'm just going to call them toxic, and I'm just going to call them narcissistic, and I'm just going to give them all these identifiers without also maybe assessing the whys of why they are the way that they are, and also understanding that they too could have vulnerabilities that are leading them to a place where they might act in a frustrating way, or they might act in a way that's annoying to you, but it's not always that simple. And people who piss us off and people who we don't like also can be vulnerable people. And I think the main thing that proves that this is true is the fact that people that we like a lot and people that we get along with very well and very easily can absolutely be manipulative and predatory. So just something for you to maybe think about while listening to the rest of this video. Just really assessing these biases. But I think it's just so important more than anything for people to really look at their vulnerabilities and try to say, what is it about me that is vulnerable? What are my vulnerable areas in how I think about life and how I think about myself? Do I struggle with black and white thinking? Do I struggle with seeing nuance? Do I struggle with looking for feelings and fantasies instead of facts and information? Or on the opposite side, do you struggle with seeing black and white sort of facts and information too much? You know, it's just really kind of looking at your own mind and saying what is working and what is not. Doing a check-in of sorts is always really good, but obviously the check-ins can be hard to do if we're doing them ourselves. It's hard for a broken machine of sorts. If our mind has different things that aren't working well, it's hard for that machine to fix itself or to see its own faulty mechanisms, obviously. I think another thing that's a vulnerability is not knowing your own indicators. So, you know, again, with the slideshow that I created, it's really looking at what different indicators might be. Body posture is an indicator. It's a huge indicator. It's not that they can't be wrong, because I still have really bad posture too, and people will make all kinds of assumptions about me that are very outdated now. And I'm like, okay, you know, my posture still reflects old me, but new me is very spicy and knows how to stand up for myself. So it's not like just because you have an indicator that therefore is who you are. But I think I still have more creepy people come up to me and try different things with me because of my indicators. They're not successful. It doesn't go well for them, but they approach me, you know, and they might approach lots of different people for different reasons, but I know that body posture is a huge indicator. Another one is obviously just indicators of you being impoverished or tired. Those are lots of indicators that people who are more predatory can read on people. Depression can show it a lot of times too, outwardly, whether we realize it or not. Lots of things. I think there's also indicators that tell stories whether we like it or not. When I talk about clothing, it's always kind of a sensitive point with women, and I understand why it is. So many times we've been conditioned to be like, oh, we need to dress a certain way to please men, or we need to dress a certain way because society tells us to be X, Y, and Z sort of way. And there very much is obviously this movement now where women just want to be who they want to be, which is perfectly valid. And they have the right to do that for themselves. However, whether you like it or not, whether we like it or not, our clothing does tell a story. And is that really annoying? Yes. Is it shit that people make assumptions? Yes. But our clothing does tell a story. And I have intentionally changed the way that I dress, whether people agree with this or not. This is my life and these are my choices. And I have changed the way that I dressed because I wanted to send a certain message that would keep certain types of men away from me. And it's been successful, and that's exactly what I wanted to achieve. But I think it also just shows that the way that we dress can deter or attract certain things to us. And I know that there are people out there looking for genuine connection, genuine love. They want to be seen. They want to be heard. They want to be loved as a person who matters, which is what they are. And there can be times where the way that you're dressing and the way that you're acting can send a certain message, can tell a certain story. And I just encourage people to consider that if you're looking for a different life for yourself, if you're trying to change the rhythms of what you attract and the rhythms of what you're consistently running into, there are ways to do that. Is it unfortunate that that's the way the world is? Yes. But I'm just letting you know that there are ways to do that. And I've worked with several anti-trafficking organizations in the area locally. One person from one of them literally told me that she's met other prostitutes, ex-prostitutes, who have done the same exact thing, who have intentionally changed the way that they dress to attract or deter predatory people. Attract less predatory people / deter predatory people. So that's just the world that we live in. And when people say, like, that's unfortunate, that's not fair, we all do it. We all make assumptions about people based on how they're dressed. Like, just flicking through some of these pictures right now, like, looking at this guy and the way that he's dressed, you're going to make assumptions about him. What assumptions are you going to make? What story do his clothes tell you? They tell a story. Could we be wrong? Yes, but like, we're absolutely going to make assumptions about this guy. We just are. It's just what happens. Looking at the woman in this photo, what are we going to assume about her? That she's a ranch hand? You know what I mean? That she she might know how to work with animals. She might know how to work with the ground. There's lots of things that we could assume about her based on how she's dressed, that there's a certain lifestyle that she lives, and there's certain interests or knowledge that she has. Looking at this guy in this photo, lots of assumptions we can make about him. I even know when I worked with the prison population briefly when I was younger, they totally would look at what people were wearing just in terms of like designer brand. You know what I mean? Like, this is a very real thing that happens. So it's just another indicator to be aware of that you have. I've told this story in other interviews and I think in maybe some other videos, but I'll tell it here too, just as like another example of how casing works and how obvious indicators can be to other people, even if you don't know how to spot them or look for them. I worked with the prison population, and I worked with people who worked with the prison population, like probation officers and COs and things like that, correctional officers. And one correctional officer I was talking to at this training that I went to, basically they said that when someone becomes a correctional officer in the training, they tell them not to come into work with wrinkled clothes, that they always have to come in with like ironed clothes. Because if they come into work with wrinkled clothes, it's not that it doesn't look professional, it's that the prison population will know that they're tired. And if they know that they're tired, they are now an incredibly vulnerable person to get picked on, to possibly get a fight started with. There's just a lot of things that can happen from them seeing them with wrinkled clothes. So they tell them that they have to iron their clothes before they come in. That's just another example of how one aspect to ourselves can speak volumes and tell an entire story, whether we like it or not. And I just want to say, I'm not just talking about one way of dressing. Like, if you look at the girl in this picture, she also tells a story about herself that indicates vulnerabilities. It indicates possibly being sheltered. It tells its own story, you know. I'm just pointing out that the way that we dress does tell stories, whether we like it or not. Super quick, I'm editing this video like half awake, but I just realized that another really like good example of this on just like the extreme end, because sometimes if you like see the extremes, then it can help you see like the subtleties of other things, you know what I mean? It just helps you see the patterns. It's almost like when you're doing still life drawing, you need like a very high contrast light at first to be able to recognize the shadows, but then after a while you're able to like spot them and draw them easier, whatever. Anyway, I just feel like with Eugenia Cooney, if you look at this person, she has vulnerability written all over her. Like, not only vulnerability, but like anxiety, depression, mental illness. Like, there's definitely something going on. You know, like, we don't know what it is. We don't know what the full story is, but there's definitely something going on. And obviously, the ways that we like dress and talk and our posture and things like that, people can be wrong. Like I said, like, people make assumptions about me based on my posture, but they're wrong. So the story can be wrong. It's just a possible story, I guess is a better way of saying it. But yeah, when you look at her, like, it tells a definite possible story. And the other example I wanted to put in here really quick, which I also think just kind of like shows the same type of example, is this is what I looked like before my sexual assault. And this is what I look like. And this is how I dressed. And this is what my style became after my sexual assault. And I think that also just kind of shows what I was trying to express out loud. And when I've shown this like PowerPoint to a couple of people, the one thing that I really tried to emphasize with them is like, use this to have compassion for people, not to judge them, to have compassion. Really look and see people's vulnerabilities and things that might tell a possible story about them to try to understand them better. That's the main point. You know, we're not predators. We're not people trying to find things to help us exploit. It's to draw us closer to one another. I think it's also interesting just to think about the concept of gray rocking with all of this, because it's so different than what's popular in society right now. Like, in society right now, obviously it's about like making a statement about who you are and expressing your true identity and all this stuff, which honestly pre-Freud was not even a thing. Not only pre-Freud, but pre what his cousin Edward Bernays did with Freud's theories in the advertisement industry. Like, before all of that, people didn't even care about things like that. So obviously it's a thing now though. But I just think when you examine like, yeah, that's the popular thing to do, but then here's this other approach to life called gray rocking, you know, where you almost try to you try to blend in, you try not to give off any real indicators about yourself at all. You try to not draw attention to yourself. And that also can reap its own rewards. I just don't think it gets talked about a lot, because expressing your true identity is like the popular thing to do right now. So I don't know, that was just another thought I had that I wanted to throw in here. How you stand, how you dress, how you talk. And the how you talk part is something that I've assessed a lot on my channel. When I talk about, you know, even in the video I made about storyteller techniques, I talk about like the fact that on those first few dates, if you're naturally apologizing a lot, over apologizing, over sharing, that's a verbal indicator for you lacking boundaries and lacking self-esteem. Like, you absolutely have verbal indicators that tell the people around you how you feel about yourself. And just because you're not aware of them doesn't mean that they're not there. And then this is a chart of vulnerabilities. In it, you can obviously see that a lot of these come down to sort of disabilities and limitations, whether physical or emotional. That's a real vulnerability. Or it can be a sort of maltreatment of sorts, where it's, you know, addictive habits, trauma that's very limiting and handicapping, you know, different things like that, things that weaken you, kind of, essentially. And then you have, you know, what I would call a harsh internal compass, where the ways that you measure love, the ways that you measure abuse and self-worth are all just like very skewed and very off, and all sort of point to narratives that leave you susceptible and vulnerable to abuse, because they line up perfectly with how an abuser would want you to think about things. You're almost like already primed and rewired with those types of stories or narratives inside of you. So you have that harsh internal compass that they need you and want you to have. These are all vulnerabilities for sure. But just like I touched on in the earlier part of this video, the other thing I want people to be aware of is that you have cognitive vulnerabilities as well. You already tend to think in black and white ways. That's how a manipulator is going to encourage you to think. And it's so easy to isolate, for them to encourage you to isolate yourself from your loved ones and your friends and your family, your important people, if you think in black and white. They're going to be able to flip your logic so quickly, because if things only can be good or bad, evil or not evil, and if they start to plant seeds of doubt in you about your family or your important people, and your brain thinks that you have to choose, that it has to be one or the other, and they start planting those seeds of doubt in you, you eventually will start isolating and cutting those people out. So black and white thinking is not your friend, and it absolutely will only ever work against you. And it's a great tool for manipulators to use. So if you already have that tool inside of you that's activated, they're going to use the crap out of it. So there's lots of reasons why you want to get rid of black and white thinking. It's not just because it'll make your life miserable, because it will, and it'll inhibit you from being able to enjoy life in a way where things can make you unhappy and things can make you uncomfortable, but it doesn't mean that you have to run away from them or cut them out of your life necessarily. There will be so much less loss, so much less traumatic loss in your life when you get rid of black and white thinking. But that aside, it's also because it's a tool that will always be used against you by manipulators. They will encourage you to think this way, and then they will take the thing that you're trying to use to protect yourself, and it will be used to exploit you every single time. So definitely something you want to work on getting rid of. The fantasy-based bonding, which I just talked about in my previous video. Fantasy-based bonding makes it easy to find. But yeah, once again, if you're vulnerable to being someone who looks for a story, who needs a story, who needs there to be a fantasy, who needs there to be a hero, who needs, where you need yourself to be the hero and you need there to be a victim, because it's not always that you need a hero. Sometimes you need there to be a victim, like in codependency. I think that's a huge version of fantasy-based bonding, in my personal opinion. But either way, if you need there to be a story, these people have a story to sell, and they would love for you to believe it. And once again, it will be something that is used to exploit you over and over again. It will be a tool that's used against you, and they will encourage you to think this way because it can be used to your detriment constantly. Life is not a movie. And life oftentimes is very boring and not super exciting unless you're able to change the way that you think about things. And then life is a very, very interesting ride indeed. Half of it is perception. And I think that you really can see that because when you're addicted to fantasy-based thinking and chasing that fantasy everywhere, we can absolutely trick ourselves into thinking that some sort of fucking Disney story is going on that isn't. All the time. We can shift our perception constantly in the delusional thinking that we'll have, in the ways that we like hide the negative truth from ourselves, you know, and we have that sort of like disassociation of sorts. The cognitive dissonance really is what I would call it. That cognitive dissonance is, I think, really the best example to show how we can choose how we think about our reality all the time. Most of the time in an abusive relationship, you're not seeing the reality for what it accurately is anyway. And so it shows how much of your perception of reality is a choice. So you can choose to think of life in more positive and exciting ways all the time if you want to, outside of abusive relationships too. But either way, you really want to make sure that you're aware of this problem if you have it, and also just being aware of it because it will be used to exploit you. And it is another vulnerability. It's another vulnerability if you're not aware of it at all. I think once people become aware of these tendencies, it actually can be kind of empowering sometimes, because then it's not something that's just forcing you to, you know, be like a leaf in the wind where because you don't know why you're doing what you're doing. This thing's just tugging you this way and that, and you have no control over it. Once I've learned why I am the way that I am in a lot of ways, so much more of what I do is a choice. I can choose to engage in codependency. As crazy and maybe messed up as that sounds, there are times where, I'm like, you know what? This is something that I want to do in this moment. And the roots of it might be not super healthy, but it's not going to control me, and I'm not going to run away with it because I know the roots of it and I'm going to control it. But it is something that I want to engage with in this moment. You know what I mean? I want to be overly helpful towards someone, and it's going to feel really nice. And then I'll be able to move on, but it's not going to be something that I'm just blindly doing that turns into this rabbit hole of codependency, because I'm aware of it. So it's a more educated choice that I'm making. And the last thing I wanted to point out, which it is on the original chart that I showed you, which listed addiction. But the main thing that I wanted to talk about from a different aspect is addictive thinking, which is similar but different. Addiction is addiction. Addictive thinking, I think, is something that happens from having lots of abuse in your childhood or whatever. But typically, it's, again, you being sort of pre-rewired or pre-indoctrinated into a sort of way of having needs that lines up a little too well with the dynamics of abuse. So with addictive thinking, which typically comes with a history of addiction of some kind, but honing in on the addictive thinking specifically, you're needing those highs and those lows. That's what your normal is. That's what you kind of feed off of. It's something that you honestly enjoy, or I enjoyed, because it was comfortable, because it was my normal, and because you're getting freaking high out of it. You know what I mean? Like, who would not enjoy that? Who would not? So yeah, just being aware of the addictive thinking, because there are people I've met who don't think that they're an addict because they've never struggled with substance abuse or smoking or any of these more like common forms of addiction that really just wreak havoc on your entire life. But that doesn't mean that you're not a freaking addict. That doesn't mean that you're not addicted to something. And that also doesn't mean that you don't have sort of addictive compulsions inside of you and addictive types of thinkings where you chase highs and lows in different areas that maybe you and the other people around you just aren't aware of because you've never really paid attention to it. But it doesn't mean that you don't have this mechanism just because you haven't done one of the more like glamorized Hollywood versions of addiction. Lots of room there for other addictions to be present. They're just not as like sexy and sold in the media, and I almost think sometimes those are the more dangerous ones. One of my favorite writers, David Foster Wallace, who is dead now, one of the things he talked about was how he had TV addiction, and he was so tired of being asked all the time in interviews about this possible substance abuse issue that he had, which he alleged he never had. And he was like, even if I did though, the real addiction that almost destroyed my entire life was TV addiction, and no one wants to ask me about that because it's not sexy and because it's not glamorized in a way that people find interesting. But it is a very real issue, and it just pissed him off that people were never really wanting to talk to him about the real addiction that he actually had, and they just wanted to chase this piece of gossip that had nothing really to do with his life whatsoever. So that's just kind of a video that I wanted to make tonight. It was just something I was thinking about, just how people aren't really aware of their indicators and their vulnerabilities, and it has helped me a whole lot amongst all of the many other neurotic things that I've realized. It has helped me a whole lot to just really look internally to say, how am I a vulnerable person? Because I really don't think the question is, are you a vulnerable person? I think literally every single person is a vulnerable person. Even when I've engaged with people who are more sociopathic and somewhat predatory, they still had vulnerabilities. Like, grandiosity is a vulnerability. People who, that's the other part of it, people who over-glamorize sociopaths and act like they're these sort of demigods that have no chinks in their armor, it's so unrealistic. Like, every single person has some kind of vulnerability to themselves, because literally no one is a demigod and literally no one is flawless without vulnerabilities. That's almost the point. And so there are even people that I've, been friends with or interacted with where I could very clearly tell, like, yes, they are an intelligent predator. Yeah. And I don't even mean sexual predator, just, they're a manipulator and they're kind of a predator. And yes, they're good at exploiting people. And yes, they're good at all these different things like running a business and triangulating and smelling out people's emotional needs. That's all great. That's all fine, well, and dandy. But that doesn't mean that they don't have vulnerabilities. And it's really interesting because when you study serial killers, one of the reasons that they get caught is because of their narcissistic grandiosity. Their narcissistic grandiosity is so freaking off the charts that half the time after they've committed whatever murders they've committed, they will just throw the bodies away in the dumpsters right outside their house. Or they'll do something just like so not well planned with their crimes because that grandiosity causes them to have blind spots in their own judgment. That's just one example I can think of, but either way, it's not a question of whether we are vulnerable people. It's a question of what are our vulnerabilities. Thanks as always for watching, and God bless.